Hello, everybody. Welcome to this very exciting semi-plenary on the state and future prospects of global environmental governance. My name is Karin Bäckstrand, and I'm a professor in environmental social science at Stockholm University. And we are very happy to host this semi-plenary on the achievements and setbacks of multilateral environmental diplomacy the past 5 decades, and also in the run-up to the Stockholm Plus 50 summit that will be hosted by the Swedish government. So we felt it was in June next year, it was a time to take an overall stock of the future and current multilateral environmental diplomacy. And I'm very happy that we have an excellent panel of fantastic speakers, both with experience from scholarship on global environmental politics and also, which is very important, the practice of global environmental governance on issues such as UN reform, how to shape a more transformative multilateral diplomacy. And so we have 1.5 hours of very exciting themes here to discuss. So I will start with actually introducing all the speakers that will, and our moderator, and then they will be given a maximum of 15 minutes to elaborate on the themes. And then we will have a roundtable discussion. And then, very importantly, we want your questions, your comments, which you will be able to submit in the chat, and that will be taken care of the moderator. And so already now, think of questions how we can shape a more transformative multilateral diplomacy to achieve both handle climate change, achieve the sustainable development goals, and facilitate the green recovery in a hopefully post-pandemic world. But first, our excellent speakers, we will have the following order. We will start with Pamela Chasek, that I don't think needs much introduction, but for you who haven't met her, she's a professor in political science at Manhattan College in New York City, and she is a co-founder and executive editor of the Earth Negotiating Bulletin that we all have used so much in fieldwork. And she has written many textbooks in the field. I have loads of them on my courses in global environmental politics. Her latest book is on global environmental politics, transforming multilateral diplomacy, the insider story of the Sustainable Development Goals. So she will give an overview with her extensive experience in the practice and scholarship of global environmental politics that we look forward to. Our next speaker is Maria Ivanova. She's an associate professor of global governance and director of Center for Governance and Sustainability at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And she has, like Pamela, written extensively on UN reform and also participated in scientific advisory board of the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. And her latest book is very timely given the theme of Stockholm Plus 50. It's the untold story of the world's leading environmental institution, UNEP, that is coming out with MIT Press, that has come out with MIT Press. So that is going to be very exciting to hear more about. And then last but not least, Pilar Bueno is a senior researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technical Research of Argentina. She's also a member of the UNFCCC Adaptation Committee, and she's really juggling here between different meetings. So we are very happy to have you. And she's a professor at the National University of Rosario. And she works on various aspects of climate change. So we really also look forward to hear from you on the front practice of climate change negotiations. Then we have an excellent moderator, Naghmeh Nasiruttisi. It's a very dear colleague of mine at the Department of Political Science at Stockholm University. And Naghmeh is a postdoctoral researcher there, and her focus is on climate change, energy governance, the legitimacy and effectiveness of climate governance, with a focus very much also on non-state actors. And she has also written so many articles and books on the governance of climate change. And she will really look into your questions for the Q&A session and try to bring them forward to the speakers. So on that note, I think we should just start. So Pamela, the floor is yours.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm going to start in Stockholm and sort of do a quick recap of the last 50 years and where we're heading from Stockholm. So just by way of introduction, in 1972, Apollo 17 took the first color photograph of the Earth, which you see on the screen. And it showed our world as this blue marble against a black expanse. And it was the first time that people on Earth got a sense of sort of how we looked from outer space and how this Earth was this whole intricate mechanism of supporting this incredibly complex web of interacting and interconnected life. But at the same time, we were facing a number of environmental disasters. And over the previous decade before that photo was taken, numerous events sparked concern about the environment. 750 people, this is bottom right, died in the pea soup fog attributed to air pollution in London. You also had the Cuyahoga River catch on fire in the US state of Ohio, which is bottom left. You had a major fish kill in the Rhine River that killed an estimated, that killed tons of fish. And you also had the Torrey Canyon oil spill, along with other oil spills, including in Santa Barbara in the United States. Japan mourned 2,265 victims of mercury poisoning caused by a toxin that was released into Minamata Bay. Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring, about the devastating effects of chemicals and pesticides. And so all of this was happening. And you had this sort of environmental awakening taking place at this time. The government of Sweden was concerned and actually proposed to the UN General Assembly that the UN address environment. The word environment is not mentioned in the United Nations Charter at all. And there was no way for people to address environmental issues really within the United Nations at this point. So this was, they were there on the peripheral, but the Swedish proposal said that we should have a conference that addresses the problem of the human environment because these problems are continuing to grow. Sweden, as a middle power, was able to sort of challenge the United States and the Soviet Union in this and bridge the Cold War that was going on at the time and was possibly at one of its highest points. And the response was surprising. Everyone agreed for the most part to hold this conference. I don't have time in this presentation to go into actually the East-West conflicts that were going on at this conference, but suffice it to say that the preparations started. Morris Strong was named as the Secretary General by then UN Secretary General U Thant, and they put together a series of outputs that they wanted the conference to take. The importance of some of these outcomes still plays with us today. So the first output was the Stockholm Declaration, which was a series of principles on the environment, and actually were carried through and many represented as well in the Rio Declaration that took place 20 years later. They also negotiated an action plan to focus on what were considered to be the main environmental issues at the time. And interesting, a lot of the plan was spent on ocean issues. Ocean issues were seen as and ocean pollution was one of the biggest issues and pervades throughout the action plan. They also saw a number of issues that required immediate action, and they had a section on that, which they recommended in terms of treaties and other actions that the United Nations could take. And they established an organization that would be responsible for follow-through. At least they proposed it, which had to be further formally endorsed by the UN General Assembly. I'm not going to talk much about UNEP in this presentation because Maria's on this panel and she will handle all things UNEP. So Stockholm's legacy was pretty important. First, we really saw the beginning of multilateral environmental cooperation and treaty making, and I'll come back to treaty making in a moment. The legal principles and the political goals that came out through the Stockholm Declaration have basically underpinned environmental discourse and lawmaking for half a century. We've started to learn more about the environment. The establishment of the UN Earthwatch system provided information for research and monitoring environmental issues, which led us to have a better understanding of environmental issues. The Stockholm Conference led to the creation of numerous national environmental ministries. Most countries did not have one. And also it led to many environmental laws. We also saw the democratization of environmental debate, and actually even in the United States, because United Nations, because the door was open to non-governmental organizations that had no access to the UN system, with the exception of the few that were part of the Economic and Social Council. So this was the first step towards expanding non-governmental activities within the United Nations. And finally, the forerunners of sustainable development came out of the Stockholm Action Plan and the Stockholm Declaration. While these were formally codified through the Brundtland Commission that took place in the 1980s and then in the 1992 Earth Summit, still all of this got its start in Stockholm. Stockholm also led what many could consider the dawn of the mega conferences. While the mega conferences really took off in the 1990s. In fact, during the 1990s, there was pretty much a mega conference almost every single year. But with regard to the environment and with regard to sustainable development, there have been 3 to date. There was one 10 years after in 1982. It does not really count as a mega conference. It was held in Nairobi as part of UNEP to review the first 10 years after Stockholm. But it was not a big conference like we've seen in the subsequent 3 conferences. And so in 1992 in Rio, in 2002 in Johannesburg, and 2012 back in Rio, these huge conferences took place to continue to advance thought, generate mobilization on these environmental issues, and these sustainable development issues, and continue to promote the establishment of environmental laws, environmental treaties, other activities that could help protect the environment. Once again, due to lack of time, I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but we all know that out of Rio, we got Agenda 21 and we got the Rio Declaration. We also got treaties, which I'll deal with in a minute. In Johannesburg, they adopted the Johannesburg Plan of Implementation. So to further implement Agenda 21, and also it brought in a lot more of the social development side of sustainable development because just prior to this conference was the adoption of the Millennium Declaration and the elaboration of the Millennium Development Goals. In 2012, back in Rio, this conference set us on a path to adopt the Sustainable Development Goals, which picked up where the Millennium Development Goals left off and created this sustainable development agenda that the UN is following through from now, from 2015 until 2030. This process also led to the development of many multilateral environmental agreements. Some had already been in negotiation before the Stockholm Convention. The London Convention on ocean dumping was a major priority in Stockholm, and they called for swift adoption of the London Convention. CITES was also under negotiation at this point and was also mentioned in Stockholm for this swift adoption of this treaty to deal with the trade in endangered species. MARPOL, which was another convention adopted in 1973 on the prevention of pollution from ships, was also an issue addressed highly in Stockholm. In the interim period between Stockholm and Rio, UNEP took the lead on calling for the negotiation of and actually negotiating a number of treaties, including the Basel Convention on Transboundary Disposal of Hazardous Waste, and the Vienna Convention and the Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer. During the time that negotiations were taking place on Agenda 21, which was adopted in Rio in 1992, there were several parallel negotiations going on, and Maurice Strong, who was also the Secretary General in Rio, wanted these treaties to be completed so that they could be opened for signature in Rio, which he thought would attract more heads of state and more public attention to the Rio conference. He had originally hoped that there would be 3 treaties adopted at Rio. 2 were the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that Pilar will talk about more, I'm sure, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. There was also hope that there would be a treaty on forests that was adopted in Rio, but the political divisiveness over the forest issue, including who should host negotiations on forests, should it be FAO or should it be UNEP, did not lead to those negotiations. So in Rio, they adopted the Statement on Forest Principles, which paved the way to several rounds of creation of new organizations in forests within the UN system, and the current one is the UN Forum on Forests. Other treaties were called for in Rio, which included the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, as well as work on chemicals that led to the Rotterdam Convention, the Stockholm Convention, and later the Minamata Convention on Mercury. These are by no means not all of the MEAs, but I wanted to bring up these because many of them came directly from Stockholm or the conferences since Stockholm. And the Sustainable Development Goals, which came out of Rio, if you look back to the Stockholm Action Plan, not all of these issues were mentioned there, but most of these issues have carried through since Stockholm. So they didn't come out of the blue when the Sustainable Development Goals were negotiated, but they carried through from Stockholm through to Rio, the first Rio conference, definitely in Johannesburg, and then finally into Rio as these negotiations took place. And I don't want to spend too much time on these because I want to look more at where we're going. But I'm happy to answer any questions of these. But when you look at the topics and you look at the action plans that came out through these conferences, and you see definitely there was a strong trajectory there. So what lessons have we learned since Stockholm? One of the questions that's come up quite a bit is actually the sustainability of mega conferences. Are we doing the planet good by holding these huge mega conferences, bringing in, thousands of people and hundreds of heads of state and government into these conferences. And what comes out of them? Action plans. Have these action plans actually been implemented? Every time we've had another conference, we have bemoaned the state of the planet. We have bemoaned the state of implementation. We've called for something new. Is it worth it? Well, some argue that you need these mega conferences to capture the public's attention. That by having these conferences, the media pays attention. They send out messages to the public. Numerous national and local media will do special features on the environment in their local areas or on areas of sustainable development. This pressure that's put on through the media and through public attention can actually secure political agreements and enable politicians, heads of state, and others to make additional commitments to help the environment. We also saw, as a result of many of these conferences, new laws have been enacted at the national level that perhaps might not have been enacted without the attention given by these global conferences. Greater interaction with civil society has taken place as a result of these conferences, not just at the UN level, but in many countries as well, opening up the space for greater government dialogue with people. But do they catalyze the necessary actions to promote sustainable development? If the results of each of these conferences is lackluster implementation, are they worth the efforts, money, and the carbon footprint of holding them? And this is a question that's being grappled with that I don't have necessarily the answer to. But they do set the global agenda and they do catalyze action, maybe not the amount that we need. Do we need so many multilateral environmental agreements? And I know I'm about out of time. I'm sure that this has been an issue discussed by UNEP over the years, and I don't know if Maria will tackle this, but there's been a lot of talk about there's too many agreements, too many conferences of the parties, too many subsidiary body meetings that Pilar can speak about. So do we really need them? Can we pull them together? The chemicals conventions do have a single secretariat and hold joint COPs. Can this be done with more? Do we need to keep negotiating new multilateral agreements, or are there better, more effective ways to help the environment? Do we need to strengthen environmental governance? This has been a story in UNEP since UNEP was created, and I'll leave that also to Maria. And then finally, without political will, can any of this happen? Governments and companies and individuals often look out for themselves. They don't look out for the planet as a whole. And as we're seeing most definitely within the climate change talks, that we're not, without political will and without economic will, we're not going to get there and we're not going to achieve sustainable development. And no mega conference may necessarily get us beyond that. So I'm leaving you a lot of questions with very few answers. But as people have heard me speak before, that's sort of what I do, is give you food for thought and food for our discussion later. So I don't really have time of where we're going with Stockholm Plus 50, but I think these are some of the questions that we need to grapple with as we're going to the Stockholm conference, which due to COVID is probably not going to be as mega a conference as maybe people would have hoped, but is also an opportunity for us to discuss where we're going in the next 50 years and where some of these questions can be answered. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Pamela, for setting the scene and framing the debate here. I think you raised some very important issues that we can come back to in the question and answering session. I feel very flattened that Sweden is a middle range power. We usually are called the small power. So hopefully in terms of ideational and normative influence. Thank you so much. And we should definitely come back to your questions. On that note, I am very happy to leave the floor to Maria Ivanova, and we want to hear all things about UNEP and reform options of the fragmented global environmental governance structure. Please, we look forward to your
Thank you very much, Karin. Thank you very much, Pam, for setting such a solid background and the foundation for this discussion. Yes, you raised a lot of questions. I don't know if any of us have answers, but this is the space to really explore these questions. And you're absolutely right. What COVID has done is change that mega conference setting. And at the same time, look at what we're doing right now. We're bringing many more voices into the global Zoom room. And maybe, Karin, this is on your docket as a Swede, as someone who is engaged in these debates, to see how can we even further democratize these mega conferences. I think, Pam, this is an important issue that you also flagged. The Stockholm Conference was the first one where civil society came in. And perhaps the Stockholm Plus 50 could be the first conference where the civil society voice is used in a different way through these global online discussions. So that is to be discovered. I just want to say also, Karin's father was involved in the discussions in Stockholm, and he was one of the people that I interviewed for as I tried to figure out what was happening with UNEP. So this community goes deep and wide, and there's so much potential of engagement. So what I want to talk about today is one of the issues that was raised in the concept note about reimagining environmental multilateralism. And so I will zero in on UNEP, the UN Environment Program, that was the institution created at Stockholm. And both Pam and I share little glimpses of that Stockholm conference and what was happening at that time. Here is from the newspaper, the ECO newspaper, the vision for environmental multilateralism in 1972. That was the vision. The common peril unites us. But look at what we're doing. This was the prediction of 1972. But I'd like to give you my thesis statement right at the beginning. For effective environmental multilateralism, we need effective multilateral institutions. And UNEP was created as the anchor institution for the global environment. And we cannot have effective multilateralism without an effective UNEP. How is that to be done? Is exactly what we'll talk about. So I have now finally produced the academic book on UNEP, because surprisingly, even though this institution was created 50 years ago, there has been no academic book about this international environmental institution. We have a lot of books on the World Bank, on the World Health Organization, on CITES, on the World Trade Organization, and yet not on UNEP. So it took a lot of years to produce this, because it was the result of a lot of conversations, of looking into the archives of the United Nations, of the people that actually were thinking about UNEP, and then putting together what I now call the untold story of the world's leading environmental institution. It happened through convening conversations. I'm happy to share with you today and in the future the various insights from the people who imagined the institution, led the institution, worked for it in various settings. Many of them have passed. In 2009, I had the honor and the privilege to convene for the first and now only time all 5 UNEP executive directors at the time. This is what you see here on the photo on the right, with Maurice Strong from the right to Mustafa Tolba, both of whom have now passed, Elizabeth Dowdeswell, Klaus Topfer, and Achim Steiner. And we convened also the thinkers behind it. On the left, you see Ambassador John MacDonald, who was in the US State Department when the United States was actually a leader in creating UNEP. And he imagined an international institution and drafted 4 resolutions that would actually become Resolution 2997 that created UNEP. So what I would like to state quite forcefully is that UNEP was created as the anchor institution for the global environment. And what I articulate in the book, and what I would like to kind of leave you with, is that the origin story of UNEP was one of creating the world's ecological conscience. That UNEP was not deficient by design. And this is against much of the IR literature suppositions, and a lot of what we talk about that comes naturally to us as political scientists. Oh, states would not want to create a powerful international organization. But then when you dig deep, who are the states? It was the John McDonalds at the time that was the United States. What were they thinking? The design of UNEP was quite deliberate in terms of its institutional form, its function, its finances. And the picture that I have unearthed is the one of a vision by these statesmen and women at the time, that imagined an organization that would be small, that would be nimble, that would be effective. And so UNEP's form as a subsidiary body, which is often criticized, was actually the most feasible form at the time. And I argue it has not prevented it from being effective. It is not the form, it is not the function or its mandate, which was quite ambitious. And it is not the original finances, which were also quite ambitious. And I'll walk you through that in a little bit. We often criticize UNEP for having very little money. And it's true, it does have little money. However, we have to ask ourselves why, and where is that explanation? It is not the original vision. Something happened over time. In the book, I also talk about the goal attainment and the problem resolution. The goal attainment, has UNEP actually fulfilled the functions that it was supposed to fulfill? And the problem resolution, have the environmental problems been resolved? Of course, the answer to the latter question is not really, no. However, UNEP is the institution that is credited with, and rightly so, with the addressing the ozone depletion layer. And why is that? There are 3 core explanations that I set out in the book. I will not talk much about it, but we could discuss capacity, connectivity, and credibility of the organization. But probably the main point that I'd like to leave you with today is that leadership matters. It's leadership by institutions and leadership by individuals. So just to highlight some of these points on the finances, we often say, oh, UNEP has very little money because it has a voluntary environment fund. Well, if we are to compare the finances of international organizations, and the acronyms at the bottom that many of you know quite well, or even if you don't, the O's are the organizations, the P are the programs or subsidiary bodies. And so UNEP falls, yes, toward the end, or somewhat after the middle. It's all voluntary financing, but then the 4 highest incomes or budgets in the United Nations of international organizations are all of subsidiary bodies. The World Food Programme, UNICEF, UNDP, UNHCR. These are all subsidiary bodies. They are not specialized agencies. So the fact that UNEP's funding is voluntary does not mean that it is small because of that. The causality is not because of the institutional form. Even in the beginning, the Environment Fund, that voluntary financing mechanism, was envisioned as much to grow to $100 million a year. That is significant. If you see here in the dotted line, this is adjusted for inflation, the Environment Fund, and it's about $120 million in the 1970s. That is pretty significant. That if adjusted for inflation today, I mean, this is really significant. We cannot, the Environment Fund has not even lived up to that level now 50 years later. However, UNEP's income as a whole is much larger than we give it credit for. In much of the literature, we only count the Environment Fund as UNEP's income. However, here in the book, I have pieced together UNEP's financing from the last 50 years. And you can see that the Environment Fund is only part of its financing. A lot of it comes from earmarked contributions. Most of it now, over 80%, is from earmarked contributions. And these are contributions that governments tie to particular projects, and UNEP has to deliver on particular issues. That is where the challenge is. What can this organization do independently, and how do we get that financing to deliver on the promises that have been made? So where is UNEP now? Where should it be heading? As Pam was saying, there have been so many reform efforts over time. And yet, at its core, I argue that UNEP could be, should be a unifier and a collaborator as an institution. It has an explicit role as a connector, the connective tissue among those multilateral environmental agreements that have grown out of its own successes. It also could be, should be, has to be the authoritative scientific voice on the environment. We need to go to UNEP to know what is happening. It also should be the space for influencers and institutions to collaborate, whether it's the heads of the multilateral environmental agreements or civil society. Yes, to get down to business, to figure out how do we piece together the puzzle, the 3,000-piece puzzle. UNEP is the only institution that actually can look at the 3,000-piece puzzle from 30,000 feet down and put those issues together. It has to inspire imagination and to catalyze change. This was its mandate from the very beginning. This is what the organization was created to do. And I argue that this is where we need to go. We need to go back to the beginning, and we need to bring the leadership forward to actually make that happen. In the book, I do discuss the enabling conditions and the constraints of capacity, that is the people and the resources, the connectivity, what enables this institution to actually connect to the issues, but also to the various constituencies, and the credibility, the authority that this organization has, and the legitimacy with which it is seen. I argue that at the core of international relations, the Barnett and Finnemore statement that there are two issues that need to be fulfilled for an organization to be effective, to be in authority and unauthority. UNEP is in authority. It has the mandate to deliver. Where it still has to grow is to be the authority on the global environment. And that comes with credibility. That comes when you deliver the results that need to be delivered. What we have started at the Center for Governance and Sustainability at UMass Boston is a year-long celebration of UNEP's 50th anniversary, and created the UNEP at 50 dialogue series. We started in May with UNEP Executive Director Inger Anderson, continued in June with Achim Steiner, previous Executive Director and currently the Administrator of UNDP, and will continue now in September with Wanjira Maathai on the 29th of September. Wanjira is currently the director of WRI Africa and the daughter of Wangari Maathai, one of the civil society agitators of international institutions, and her daughter is taking her legacy forward. So here, I would like to invite you all to continue the conversation with us. And in this year of celebrating UNEP at 50, let's reimagine UNEP and environmental multilateralism more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for keeping the time and for such a rich description. And I really think, and I hope we can come back to the important questions you raised on the role of UNEP and other organizations. Should they be convener, orchestrator, or do we also need stronger mandate, more authority? It's very relevant. And I hope to come back for some questions directed to you on this. So now we have one last speaker, last but not least. It's Pilar Bueno, and who is very involved in the adaptation committee of UNFCCC. So maybe we'll get some insight from climate change and the UNFCCC workings. Please.
Thank you very much, Karine, and thank you for the invitation. And I feel very honored to share the panel with the distinguished colleagues and this panel of women. I think this is very, very important in terms of transformations, and I will come back to that soon. So. Yes, given that my intervention is focused on the multilateral negotiations on climate change, probably UNFCCC is the key area of my considerations today, space in which I have the possibility to serve during the last 10 years with different hats, as negotiator, as expert. So many things happened from 1992 that we have the adoption of this Rio Convention, of course. But indeed, we need to accept probably that not so many things according to the climate urgency. So we have that dilemma to lead with. I could like to refer during this presentation to some of the changes that I identify in this agenda. And of course, to have later a conversation on this or any other one, because of course, it's not exhaustive at all, the list of changes. One of them that need to be highlighted is the expansion of the agenda. Despite the fact that the convention itself is a multidimensional document, the early political approach was on mitigation, mainly on mitigation. And this is not the convention per se, but it's a decision. And it took some time to have a substantive expansion of the agenda, and that is exhibited today in the Paris Agreement. We can see adaptation, finance, technology, capacity building, the global stocktake, transparency for action and support, and many others. So this is one point. Another point I would like to highlight is, let's say, the relationship between national and collective level of climate action. And although, the convention includes in its Article 2, the main objective of the document, a shared nature, the original 4 elements that you also can find in the purpose of the Paris Agreement in Article 2, I consider that the PA tends to deepen this pattern through different aspects, to deepen both the collective and the national dimension. So 4 ideas there in a quick note. In terms of the collective dimension, it creates a concrete 5-year collective assessment tuned with the cycles of ambition and progression. That is the global stocktake, a new figure. indeed, it deepens the collective dimension. At the same time, in the same note, it generates a multiple collective goals, and not only the temperature goal, but also the global goal on adaptation and the long-term financial objective. So these issues also strengthen the collective view. At the same time, there are two things to highlight in terms of the national dimension. It strengthened the national level by universalizing climate action, but at the same time recognizing differentiation. And for doing so, the national determined contributions, the NDCs, are the main vehicle that it recognized. And of course, the enhanced transparency framework under Article 13 that is crucial in order to maintain the work in line, if that is possible, in terms of reporting what we do and how we do it. So it's not only about, and this reporting is referred to the whole list of elements of the Paris Agreement. So this is also important. It's not only to report on mitigation, it's to report in the whole staff of elements that we agreed in Durban in 2011. My third point here, out of these two dimensions, is the distinction between developed and developing countries. This is also very, very important. And although the annexes to the convention and the differentiation itself continue to distinguish not only the convention, but the PA, so you can find different features under finance, technology, and capacity building, of course, but also mitigation, adaptation, markets, where differentiation is very clear. But at the same time, the greatest geopolitical movement of China and US alliance, in this case, from during Obama times, I mean, from 2009 to 2015, was also to let's say, to skip the heart, the core of this traditional dispute from the Kyoto Protocol. And that is how to have these two actors on the same board, but and even recognizing the different approaches in terms of legal procedures. So I am leaving that behind for this comment. But how to have these two countries on board with pledges of both countries without questioning or changing the status quo in terms of differentiation. So, I mean, that's something massive, I think, and that was a big question for many years. We all know that the Global South has changed profoundly in these decades, and this also invites new leaderships. The previous speakers refers to leadership. I think this is critical, and it was evident from Copenhagen to here in 2009 that the emerging powers of the basic group, Brazil, China, India, and South Africa, would not allow a differentiation within the differentiation. That was the real red line of that batch of negotiations, of that track. So in that sense, the PA architecture is very smart, I believe. And it was a change without changing that. So that's the main transformation, let's say. Another issue I would like to highlight with respect to this process is referred to the changes in terms of delegations composition and numbers. This is a work we have been delivering with other colleagues in the project Argentina 1.5. And if you check, I will just refer to the very, very general numbers, not our numbers, is the work in this project. Regarding the number of state parties to the UNFCCC, you may know that this increased from 117 state parties to the convention in the COP1 that was in Berlin in 1995 to 196 state parties and 197 parties, considering the EU, at the last COP in Madrid in 2019. And the total number of participants also has grown significantly from almost 4,000 at the first COP to more than 22,000 at COP25, with a peak in Paris of more than 30,000 of attendees. The highest growth is registered in the delegations of state parties. And I would like to just to refer to the numbers very quickly. The delegations accredited by state parties went from, listen to this number, 70 and 57 to be clear on the number at COP1, to more than 11,000 at COP25. So, and even the participation of state party delegates over the total number that I refer increased for less of 20% to more than 50%. And if you wonder why this is happening, why we need bigger delegations, there are many reasons. And I will not be, again, I cannot be exhaustive, but just to mention 2 or 3 things. The first one is something I already referred, and it's the complexity of the agendas. So when you have 7, 8 conversations happening at the same time, and you have small delegations of many developing countries of 3 people that need to cover all these conversations, it's not only the topics that I refer, but the conversations within the topic. So you may have 4 conversations on mitigation at the same time, or 5, or things like that. So, and that happens a lot with transparency, for example, that is the sexy topic right now. So this is something that we need to consider. But of course, it's not only that, it's not only the complexity of the agenda, but also the salience of the topic, climate change urgency, the increasing of consciousness, of the sensitivity. I mean, there are many other issues to raise. My last point with respect to the changes is the role of women and gender issues. Women, we all know that women are the ones who really carry the greatest burden and run the greatest risk with respect to climate change. Most of the world's poor people are women. And when we talk about these, we refer to inequitable participation to decision-making, and not only to decision-making, but also to labor markets, and to be neglected in terms of community economies, and not be included in different kinds of conversations at different levels. So the UNFCCC recognized this. And for the last 20 years, this conversation has been taking place. Of course, is not enough, but at least we have some milestones, such as the Lima Work Program on gender, the Gender Action Plan on advancing gender equality and women's empowerment. And this is not only about women and the composition of the delegations, that is something very important, because it used to be an arena for men, and that need to be recognized. So that change should be highlighted. At the same time, the leadership of the bodies and the composition of the bodies, even today when we see the annual reports referring to this program and the gender plan on the bodies, we see that in adaptation, we are women, we are a lot of women, but then in finance, we have a lot of men. So that continues to happen. And this is something to change. And of course, mainstreaming gender considerations is not only bodies and representation, but also how we mainstream gender consideration in climate policies at all levels, at national level, regional. I'm finishing now, just my last comments with respect to Stockholm Plus 50. I think it really gives us, and with the rich background provided by Pamela and Maria, this gives us the opportunity, but also the responsibility to take stock. We must, my perspective is that we really must avoid traditional debates on the overlap of multilateral environmental agreements and the effectiveness. All that conversation already happened in some place. We need to move a little bit from from that. And the breaking point from my view is urgency. And that requires an immediate transition. And diplomacy also, multilateral diplomacy on environmental agreements need to transition also in terms of rules, in terms of the conversation. I salute the changes. Indeed, it wasn't enough according to the science, not for me, but science. But I think without environmental diplomacy, perhaps the breaking points could have come earlier. So now my last point is to say, I think we really need to support other movements, in particular youth movement, and understand that environmental diplomacy is no longer what it used to be, cannot be anymore, and it should move to an emergency mode, emergency diplomacy. That's what I am waiting from Stockholm +50, and I know it's a lot, but well, let's continue the conversation. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Pilar. I think you tied with this grand finale the theme of the panel very nicely together. And I think it's very important you talk about the role of states and nation and this importance of political leadership at the national level and innovation at the national level that can organically grow and have impact on the multilateral level. So when leading, when states as leaders, for example, innovate by having climate policy councils that can trickle up, so to speak. And I'm also, of course, very glad you raised the issues on women and marginalized group. It's ultimately an issue of democratization of global governance, and questions of inclusion and exclusions are still very important. Sweden itself has actually, it's one of the states, they are pushing this for Stockholm +50, but one of the states who have a feminist foreign policy, and that is still extremely provocative to many. So that says something about the state of the debate. Anyway, thanks so much for your presentation that really complemented each other. We will now have a short, I will post some question and you will have a chance to comment on the other, but we should keep this not for so long, maybe maximum 10 minutes, so we can allow in audience, question and answers from the audience. And please, all of you who listen, take the chance and opportunity to post your question in the question and answering, and our excellent moderator, Nagme, will cater to that. So I have actually 3 questions, and you can actually pick and choose which you want to answer or all. Well, I have many more questions, but we have to look on time. And I suggest we start in the reverse order. So I pose these, and you start, Pilar, and then Maria, and finally Pam. And you can take a couple of minutes to also reflect on the other presentation and choose my question. So my first question is, what is your, looking forward now, because we got the history, what is your assessment, what will the outcomes of the Stockholm +50 be? What do you think realistically in terms of political feasibility? And what do you think is needed? What is your wish list? That's the first question. The second questions concern the institutional structure of global governance. I mean, we've been discussing reform options for 40 years. And given the, I mean, triple or quadruple crisis of climate change, pandemic, biodiversity, do we actually need structural reform? The debates on World Environmental Organizations, do you think they will be coming again, given the high profile? Do we need that? Or is the current system of intergovernmental combined with national bottom-up policies coming from below sufficient? And the third question is a big one, but what do you think will be the lasting impact of COVID on multilateral environmental diplomacy? Does this mean a setback, or are there opportunities? So I know it's a very big question. We can come back to them in question and answer, but please choose what you think you want to focus on. And Pilar, please start. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karin. Indeed, they are challenging questions, very provocative. Thank you for giving us that food for thought. Some notes from my part to say in terms of the outcomes of Stockholm Plus 50. I could wait for a new, more balanced agenda. So after 50 years, as Pamela explained, I could really wait for not struggling for every single topic, so that we don't have to struggle in order to have the topics included, and to see which are the main challenges for transition. The agenda for me is the transition, and all the topics should be related to that transition. And that transition is not only energy. I'm not referring about energy. I'm referring about cultural transition. I'm referring about economic, social, all dimensions. So all the environmental traditional subtopics should be related to that, and should serve and be synergetic with that transition. So that's the first one in terms of the agenda. I think always an agenda and in an event is the first thing, or probably one of the most important, and the different documents that should provoke and invite for the conversation, also try to think out of the box, because what we always have is like the same kind of documents from the organization. So to invite other organizations also, from the multiple actors of that governance, the environmental governance that today is so rich. So we really want to read about UNEP and others and international traditional organizations, because they are, very big actors, and of course their publications are very important, but at the same time, I think it's not exclusive. So we need also other documents for that in order to inform the conversations. The third one could be new ways to do diplomacy. And this is something that appears in all presentations. So today, and from 2020, from COVID on, we didn't have the choice. So we are in this format, but we cannot choose. And every day we jump from one Zoom to another one, or Meet, or any other format. I know that is not healthy, and at the same time it's not inclusive, but it's more inclusive that the big conversations, but without many other actors and many other people that cannot join big cities for these dialogues, these conversations. So how we can mixture what we have learned, or at least I think we should have learned something. So how we can make a good mixture of what happened from COVID on. The last two are the synergies between the agendas and under the topics to avoid the silo approach. And this is something is not new at all, but not only to seek for the combination of Rio conventions, that was the approach before, but to seek for another more cross-cutting considerations, I think. So that could be a way to break the silo approach. And of course, gender is one of those, a very important note, youth, and many others. And the last one, of course, is leadership. So we are seeking for a leadership of UNEP. Yes, indeed, we are, or at least I am. We are also seeking for leadership of other actors. So we need to see that. We need to see in the conversation the rich governance. It's not just to say, but you are in the parallel events. No, you are really part of the conversation. So that's something that we cannot avoid anymore. It's very typical, for example, on the UNFCCC, a lot of changes occur, and that's something I didn't refer to, but I think it's something also important for this conversation. I leave it there. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you so much for these very important reflections. I wish we had more time. Maria.
Thank you. This is really a fascinating conversation, and I really hope we take it further. So let me jump off with where Pilar left on leadership. In terms of the outcomes of the Stockholm plus 50 event, what I would like to see is a change in the narrative from naming and blaming or shaming and blaming to a narrative of naming and acclaiming. Who are the performers? Figure out who's doing what they promised to do and acclaim them. And this is the leadership, Pilar, as you were saying, with UNFCCC, that made that change, that shift. So Christiana Figueres coming in and becoming the executive secretary of UNFCCC, this is what changed. Is that narrative, is that almost that empathy to the situation in which governments and non-governmental actors were finding themselves, the opening up to civil society, the Lima commitments, right? And so this is what I think will be absolutely critical if we could change that narrative of look who's not doing what they're supposed to do to look who is doing what they're supposed to do. There were a few questions in the Q&A about the implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. And I answered because this is the work that we are doing at the Center for Governance and Sustainability, actually measuring to what extent countries are doing what they promised to do when signing and ratifying these agreements. And what we're finding is a very positive and a very counterintuitive story. Many small countries are actually delivering on the promises that they have made. However, they don't even know about it. And so giving them that knowledge puts them in a different setting in the multilateral negotiations, because then they can stand up and say, we have committed, we have delivered, here is what we have to say. And so I think that change and shift in narrative is absolutely imperative. But for that, we need the inclusion of others. And this is indeed, to your last questions about COVID, I think what I would like to see as the lasting impact is democratization of diplomacy, is that we have more voices in diplomacy. And this is where the role of academia, I think, is absolutely critical, because as academics, we have been more exposed to the Zoom room than any other sector at a consistent, in a very consistent pace, and trying it out. The same also with multilateral diplomacy. Now governments are experimenting on how to negotiate online. And I think we need to study those patterns and see how we take them further in a much more structured and consistent way. And then finally, I'm going to end on in your middle question about structures in the World Environment Organization, because yes, this is where I could partly be very unpopular, because I am the academic that actually started by publishing very open arguments in favor of a global environment organization. And now I'm writing exactly the opposite. I do not think that a World Environment Organization is the silver bullet to resolving the problems that we have. I think we have the right structure. No, I know we have the structures that we do because there was a vision behind them. The fact that we have not delivered is not a structural, it's not a design problem. There are deeper value incentive type problems. And also some physical issues in terms of the connectivity, in terms of the credit, that also leads to credibility issues. So organizational structure is not the limiting factor. how do we make these organizational structures work is the key question. And I think the answer is not another organization from the past, from 1919, which is the specialized agency. I think we have to rethink how we do diplomacy. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Maria. And I actually think it's a strength of academics that we can change our positions and questions our core assumptions. I think that is a very part of the research process. So I would never criticize you for that. So I think it's a strength. Anyway, Pam, you have now the last word. Can we open up for a general discussion?
Well, both Pilar and Maria said some of exactly what I was going to say in response. So I'll try not to repeat them, but I find it's good that, you know, we're in agreement on a number of these things. So starting with Stockholm Plus 50. One of the things that's frustrated me through multiple conferences, and I'm not dealing with the MEAs right now because Maria answered that question, is that heads of state and ministers and others have made commitments at whether it's these environmental mega conferences, whether it's the meetings of the General Assembly on, you know, the HLPF, High Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development when it meets under the auspices of the General Assembly, and numerous other occasions where governments make commitments. And then they go into a black hole. And in Johannesburg, there were these type 2 commitments, and nobody, with the exception of a couple of people in academia, nobody really followed up on those commitments. And actually, even in that academic thing, when the funding ran out, they stopped tracking commitments. In subsequent conferences, and we see it right now with the SDGs, that governments, non-governmental organizations, private sector, et cetera, are recording their commitments on SDG implementation. But I was going through that over the summer and I realized nobody's updated. Nobody's submitted subsequent reports. Those commitments are there, but nobody's following up. So these are empty words. So I think one thing from Stockholm is that those commitments that you may be asking heads of state and government and non-governmental officials to make, there needs to be funding to monitor these commitments, to report on these commitments, to hold accountability. Yesterday, I refused to attend a meeting in person because there was no agenda and there was no accountability. So I didn't go to the meeting in person. I watched on Zoom because I'm tired of going to meetings with no accountability. And and that's at my university. It goes the same. So I think that's something very important to think of from Stockholm. We don't need empty words anymore. We need to follow up and we need to hold everyone, not just governments, but non-governmental entities in the private sector accountable for what they're saying at these conferences. With regard to environmental governance, I have always agreed with that we don't need a World Environment Organization. Maria and I have argued over this in the past. And what's another level of bureaucracy going to do? How can we better work within? My fear is with any sort of a pulling all of the MEAs together, while it would definitely reduce some of the stress on our lives, climate would take over. And all of these other issues would be subsumed. We see that already. And while all of these issues are affected by climate, and climate plays a part in all of the other MEAs at this point, it's not the only issue out there. And we still need to address these even if they're considered subtopics of climate, endangered species, biodiversity, land degradation, chemicals, all of these, yes, they're all impacted and impact the climate, but they need different ways of addressing them. They can't all be subsumed into the climate agenda as it is. As Pilar mentioned, there's already so much that's being dealt with under the UNFCCC. And so in some areas, the synergies seem to be working, particularly in the areas of chemicals and wastes, but forcing synergies in other areas where they may not be organic, in a sense, may be problematic. And so there can be a better way of addressing and a better way of doing MEAs. And actually COVID, and I'm going to phase into COVID, may have helped us a little bit because it's cut down on our travel. Yes, it's made our lives in these little boxes on screens, and it's made the difficulties of, as Pilar is facing today with being required to be in multiple places at the same time on different, on different issues. But also what it means is that we're not traveling as much. We can do more without, adding in those additional days of travel. And we can also, I think one of the things that I've just finished an article that is under second peer review on how we dealt with multilateral environmental negotiations during the first year of COVID, and looking at those impacts and where we're going. And I'm fingers crossed it'll be accepted any day now and will be out online first. But I think some of the things that we've learned through COVID is that we actually can have these discussions. My argument in the paper is there's less opportunities for trust building because we don't have those little conversations in the corridors or in the aisles. We don't build those personal relationships through these forums, although we're starting to see how people are becoming more comfortable with breakout rooms where some of those little conversations might happen. But that's a downside, and we need, and if we let a year or two of this go by, those personal relationships are not going to exist anymore because new people have been brought in. That's a challenge. But at the same time, we've become more comfortable with these sorts of discussions. And we've seen as the 18 months have gone on, how more and more MEAs are actually taking decisions. Yes, they haven't dealt with the hardest things yet. And those who do not want decisions on those difficult issues will continue to argue that we can't deal with them until we can have an in-person meeting. And that's going to continue to postpone decisions on difficult issues, I fear. But the other thing, and I'm just going to return to leadership, even though that was brought up before, is that we need leadership on multiple levels. We need not just governmental, and this fits in with what Maria said about the democratization of environmental governance. We need leadership from the private sector, from business and industry. Without their leadership, governments can say anything they want, but if the private sector doesn't do it, it's not going to happen. We need leadership from governments, from heads of state in particular. And one of the interesting things is not to put the US above everyone else, but if you looked at Maria's graph of UNEP funding, you could see a direct parallel between when there was a Democratic president of the US and when there was a Republican. And while the US is not the only funder of UNEP, that also goes to leadership and trust in UNEP, of which administration in the US and a lot of countries sort of also have followed suit with that. But that was I noticed that in that chart. So you need leadership of governments, leadership of the private sector, and leadership in civil society and non-governmental organizations to not to pressure their governments, but to also do what's positive. And that fits in with what Maria said as well. That you don't have to be a government official to make a difference and to do something. So I think not only do we need that leadership, we need to hold everyone to account out of Stockholm, to go back full circle.
Thank you, Pamela, for your very insightful comments. And I couldn't agree more. We don't need another talk shop, and MRVs, monitor, review, and verification of all these proliferating voluntary commitments are needed for accountability towards citizens. We have actually 10 minutes only left. I have not been able to follow the chat, but there are some questions. I will leave swiftly over to Nagime to lead the last 10 minutes here and forward any question from the chat or questions you have yourself to the speakers.
Thank you very much, Karin, and thank you to the speakers for very interesting presentations. And thank you to the audience for having sent in some questions. And I saw that Maria and Pamela have already started answering some questions in the chat, but I thought that we could still mention a few questions, and you can pick and choose as you did last time. So the first question is, how can we empower women in environmental policy and research? And also based on your close connections with policymaking, where do you think that political will comes from? And may I add to that, how do you think researchers can contribute to increasing political will for the necessary changes? And thirdly, what do you see as the role of UNEP? What should it be in developed countries? Because much of its work has been focused on developing countries. And there's one last question to Pilar. Do you think that the economic impacts of COVID, especially in the developing world, will influence in the debate, and the right to development will be on the top of developing countries' agendas at COP26 and at Stockholm? So there's a range of questions. Maybe we should start with Pamela. Please go ahead.
I'm just going to pick one of these, and I'm going to pick that question that you added in, Nagma, about the role of researchers in this process. And I want to take it a little bit from the gender perspective, but moreover, how can we influence? One of the things that I've noticed is, there are many women who are now involved in writing and researching about environmental issues, global environmental governance, climate change, et cetera. And I also find that, even through my work on the Earth Negotiations Bulletin, most of our people are women. And these women have gone on to work in governments, have worked in the UN system. And I think the best way to do this is as we mentor people, not just for them to stay in academia, but we need to mentor up and coming women to go into government, to go into the UN system, to prepare the best people that we can. And I've seen it over the years with just sort of tracking where people who've worked for us as grad students have gone on. And I think in academia, we have an important role there. And also, governments obviously have to work on bringing in more women. And within UN negotiations, I've seen more women in the position of chairmanships and I'm looking at a 30-year trajectory right now, more women who are playing important roles, and that just needs to continue. And I think we're on the right track there, and we can mentor more. But how else we can do in terms of, as researchers and academics, the most important thing is we have to write policy relevant work. We cannot be seen as just navel gazing academics. And Maria and I are on the same page on this because most of our work has been this way. We often get criticized for being too policy focused and that we're not theoretical enough. And as far as I'm concerned, the theoretical people, government officials and others don't understand. And the discipline has gone way in the theoretical and quantitative region, and that's all good. However, you can't expect that to influence policy. And so if we want to have a greater influence on policy, we have to write in words, we have to serve as our own scientific policy interface and translate our scientific work into these summaries for policymakers that policymakers can then take on, because they're not going to read the theoretical stuff and understand it. They're not, even if they have PhDs in political science, once you've moved onto the other side, means nothing. And you also, need to, scientific reports, as we see with the IPCC and others, need to be translated so that not only policymakers understand, but the public can understand. And I think that's the most important way that we can have an influence. And I'll leave the other questions to the others.
Thank you. Great insights there. Maria, please go ahead.
I couldn't agree more. first of all, so we have conversations here, but let me pick your middle question on the political will, and then of course about UNEP quickly. But you asked, Naghmeh, where does political will come from? And in one of my interviews with a woman who was a really powerful actor in international organizations, she said, political will is when enough people tell their governments, you will. And I think that is the moment that we currently have, of that democratization of diplomacy, that we have the ability to tell the governments, you will, and hold their feet to the fire in very different ways, with more knowledge, with more data, with more evidence, but also with stronger arguments of what the right thing to do is. Not just what the economically feasible thing is, but what is the right thing to do. And I think ultimately people are moved not only by that economic calculus, or not by the economic calculus, but by what the right thing to do is. And I think this is where the public has a much larger role. And this is where leadership comes. And we often define leadership as something at the top, but that's not what it is. It's leadership by individuals. And we've seen that role emerge, whether it's Greta or whether it's the other children in Fridays for the Future, or academics that are raising their voice and speaking out. And then in terms of the role of UNEP in developed countries, it needs to be much more integrative. It needs to be present. And this is where academia is absolutely critical. Because academics, as Pam was saying, yes, have become so theoretical, but have also neglected the anchor institution for the global environment. There is so little scholarship on UNEP. And yes, I am the scholar on UNEP. Why? Because I just keep writing about it, because nobody else does. And people say, oh, it's not important. It's such a little organization. It doesn't have funding, but it is important. And we as thinkers, as academics, as researchers have that obligation, as Pam was saying, to speak truth and to engage others in that narrative. And I'm really delighted that you have all of us in this setting, and Pilar's insights were absolutely critical and brilliant, as now you're bridging, Pilar, the worlds, because you now inhabit both of these worlds. And with this, the last words go to you.
What a responsibility. Well, no, I can agree more, as Maria said, with both Pamela and Maria, and really thank you also to the audience for these questions and these comments. Just two from my part, since we are left of time so quickly. The first one is related to the economic impact of COVID-19. I think the OECD has a tracker on this, and unfortunately we are not going so well in terms of the green packages for in terms of recovery. So probably even though my wishes are that the right to development is on the main focus from our developing countries, I'm not so sure who is behind of that, because unfortunately even my region, Latin American and the Caribbean region, is not taken on board in the same way than other regions. So we are defining like new people behind, even though with the slogan of no one behind, and that should be taken into account, considering the structural and the traditional inequalities of our region, for example, that were deepened by COVID-19. So this is not taken on board so far, not only by our countries, but also by donors, that we are completely outside the sphere of that. So that that was something that I really wanted to highlight in terms of inequality. And my very last is referred to monitoring and evaluation of action from all and from all actors. This is something that we are doing with Argentina 1.5 project. We understood the same that you already shared, that it's monitoring and evaluation is not only about countries, it's not only about nations, is to be accountable, to have more transparency. Every time is more about civil society, it's more about academia, because we have the elements, we have the nature to do that. So I want to encourage everyone to continue with that exercise and to join their voices for a global accountability and a global exercise of accountability, and not only top down in that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this excellent session. And I really want to first thank all the three speakers. I mean, you've been up so early and you delivered so wonderful presentations, very rich. And I also want to thank Nagme for helping to moderate, and the audience for coming up with so interesting question. I wish we had more time. And needless to say, the ESG IT team and the conference organizer, the technical matters function, which was very good. And I got so inspired. And as you know, this has been recorded and will be on ESG YouTube. And I think I'm going to assign for my undergraduate global environmental politics course my students to watch this next year. That will be a really wonderful way to dig into the future prospects of global environmental problems and the history. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you all hybrid or online, or maybe in real life in Stockholm in June next year. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.